This is culture powers, a video on culture powers. Number one, the productivity of femininity. I don't know if I got the right number of syllables. Femininity. The productivity of femininity. This is so obvious that it's embarrassing to have to explain it. Everything in the world, every system, every organization, every institution for 10,000 years, 10 million years was run by men, invented by men, controlled by men. And guess what? Most of the flaws in our world come from excesses of maleness. And when you look at systematic improvements like total quality applied all over the world, like re-engineering of software processes all over the world, you discover that their net effect everywhere is to make systems and work practices more feminine. That's one power of culture. Number two, the culture of devices and technologies. Devices and technologies have cultures. The iPhone 4S has a very particular culture. The Galaxy S2 has a different culture than the Galaxy S3. I use 192 dimensions of culture so that I can be very, very specific, whereas my competitors use 8 dimensions of culture, so they can't be specific. And I've got a lot of experience measuring the culture of devices, and it allows me to predict their sales, their future versions, and whether or not the company is going to survive or not. But the exact features that the next version is going to have. I can't get it, I don't get 100%, but I can get around 40% so far, and we're improving all the time. That's the second power of culture. The third power of culture is the culture of business practices. Total quality was a business practice spread all over the world. It has its own culture. Now, in Japan, it's an anti-culture to fix flaws in basic Japanese management culture. It still is. It's still the opposite of basic Japanese management culture. It came from Japan, but it's not Japanese culture at all. It's an anti-culture. Silicon Valley is not American culture at all. It's an anti-culture to the East Coast hierarchy, centrism, ponderous, legalized rigidity and hierarchy of old money on the East Coast. Business practices have cultures. And when you try to transplant them from one part of the world to another or one organization to another, you have to look at the interactions between the practice and the culture that gave birth to it and the new target culture where you're trying to transplant it to. It's a third power of culture. Fourth is cultures have dimensions. Now, academics, being lazy and in many ways, took the same 8 dimensions from a very, very weak sample, very biased sample, and a very weak statistical technique called factor analysis. And for 45 years, tens of thousands of academics just copied that 8 set of factors from a very biased sample on a very weak statistical foundation. They were too lazy to compete with it. And as a result, we know very little about culture, and we don't have any tools to handle cultures practically because those 8 dimensions of culture are so blunt and huge and broad that they give you absolutely not a clue as to what you should be doing in any situation. So they have uselessly broad dimensions, which are great for getting academic papers published and useless for everything else. So I've looked at all the dimensions from distinguishing cultures of all sorts, not national cultures, gender cultures, profession cultures, era cultures, technology cultures, interface cultures. And I found 192 published dimensions for distinguishing cultures. And mine are specific enough that they can give you tremendous insight into the interface to an Apple iPhone 4S and an iPhone Galaxy 3. So that's the fourth power of culture. The fifth power of culture is there is a culture of high performance. And it has 64 dimensions and components that are the same around the world. How they are achieved, though, around the world depends on the base culture you're moving toward high performance. But if you move Mongolian culture to high performance, it has these 64 traits. If you move American culture to high performance, it has these traits. In both cases, you tend to be feminizing the culture when you move toward high performance. And but there's some things going on other than just feminization as well. So these have been measured and developed by Vail at the University of North Carolina 30, 40 years ago, by James March at Stanford after that, by Srivastava at the Cleveland State University after that, and some people in Europe. And the result of that is that we have the 64 components of a high-performance culture, and we can measure the gap between that and whatever culture you now have, and whether particular leaders, particular ways of delivering leadership functions, particular organization arrangements, particular incentive arrangements are going to actually move your culture in the direction of those 64 or against high performance. Number 6. The sixth power of culture is inventing new cultures. Now, you have two problems. Establishing a new culture is not easy, but harder is defining the new culture you want to establish. And most people don't know how to establish a new culture. But even worse than that, they really don't know how to define what new culture they want to establish. And part of that is they haven't measured the traits of high performance cultures like I have and other people have. And number two, they are male and they're a little bit uncomfortable with the social and emotional nature of cultures and manipulating cultures. And they would prefer, finance and numbers, something that a brainless idiot monkey can understand after getting an MBA from another brainless idiot monkey professor. And of course, insightful professors are smarter than that, but not many insightful professors are in the top 10 business schools. As you can tell, Jensen's work on agent theory led to the destruction of 40% of the wealth of the American middle class in 2008 in 1 year. And that was just published this week. You think about that. That's pretty breathtaking. That indicates a depression is coming. 40% of the wealth of the American middle class disappeared in about 18 months. Centered around 2008 due to Jensen's agent theory and other Harvard University MBA professor theories. So those psychopath professors using economics to hide their own greed and then teaching generations of students to hide their greed behind economic Milton Friedman theories on Wall Street just stole 40% of the wealth of the American middle class in one and a half years. And you may dislike what I say now and disrespect what I say now, but you just wait 3 or 4 years and you're going to find that the politics of the world is something like you've never dreamed because of this giant act of theft by the elites of America from the middle of America. Then that's another power of culture. Then amazing culture cases. Think about psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud. Turns out that two cultures are involved. Number one, his theory about sexual hydraulics of human personality and anal eroticism and all that. Guess what? Infantile eroticism. All that started the week after he started taking cocaine. And he never wrote another word about that the week after he finished cocaine. So that is not really the Sigmund Freud theory of personality. That's the cocaine theory of personality. And then all the psychoanalysts after Freud who came to America and dominated psychoanalysis as a profession in America, they were doing German interpretations of American family and personal emotional situations. And what you really had was a cross-cultural benefit masquerading as a theory of the mind. And it turns out a cocaine theory of the mind. Now, the second great example of this is Peter Drucker. After the war, people like my dad found out that the German boots were better. The German bazookas actually blew up the tank instead of the person firing the bazooka, unlike the American bazookas. And that the German commanders had more democracy and freedom of decision than American commanders did. So if they were sent to attack a hill on an assumption of 400 people being up there at the top of the hill, and they found out when they ran up the hill that there were 1,500 people up there instead of 400, the German commander could write an order exception, and then a committee would examine it and approve it. And then the Germans had two-way radios in their tanks, so they could dynamically reconfigure in the battlefield based on what's going on. The Americans were so dictatorial, and still are, that they had only one-way radios in the tank, so that you could hear commands from your superior. So my father was really offended. Here he is, a democratic American, and the Germans had a more democratic command structure of all liberal places in their army. And a lot of Americans ran into that same thing. They couldn't say it to their friends. They couldn't say it to their commanders. They probably didn't say it to their wives. But they came home from the war certain that American ways, procedures, technologies, and tools were inferior to German ways. And Peter Drucker came, and without humiliating the Americans in a nice neutral technique presentation, now you're not learning German stuff, you're learning management techniques. He taught common sense German management methods of the 1920s in the 1950s, management by objectives, to foolish, barbaric Americans. These are some of the amazing culture cases that are out there. Then you have Japan running around the world, dominating 11 industries worldwide in the 1970s and 80s via their quality and their total quality program. And then you have professors at Harvard writing book after book in the 1980s, taking the word Japan out and putting the word lean in. So they wouldn't have to humiliate the Americans by teaching the Americans Japanese manufacturing. They could call it lean manufacturing. And I was offended by the intellectual dishonesty of these Harvard professors, because this was the top single American university lying about the source of their ideas, and then pretending that it was their ideas and not giving credit to the Japanese professors and scholars and business practitioners who invented these methods. That lying by the top American university in the title of their books and the table of contents of the books and their explanations of techniques and their omission of their Japanese sources in the middle of the book and at the references at the end of the book, that offended me. That kind of lying. I notice when the elites tell a lot of lies, disasters tend to follow.